500 guards. Among them were ordinary women who traded civilian clothes for SS uniforms. Inside the Stutthof concentration camp, their behavior changed. They transitioned from neighbors and shopkeepers into instruments of systematic violence. They beat prisoners. They oversaw executions. They performed these tasks with visible indifference. When the conflict ended, these women attempted to blend back into society. They discarded their insignias and returned to their villages. They expected to be forgotten. But the records remained. September 2nd, 1939. This was the date the nightmare began. It happened exactly 24 hours after Nazi Germany crossed the Polish border. Near the city of Danzig, known today as Gdansk, the occupation forces cleared a site. They established the first Nazi concentration camp located outside of German territory. They called it Stutthof. At first, the camp was a small, specialized facility. The gates opened for a specific demographic. The SS targeted Polish intellectuals, university teachers, and local priests. They rounded up political opponents and anyone capable of leading a resistance. The objective was clear: eliminate the brain of the Polish nation. The footage from this period shows rows of men in suits and glasses standing behind barbed wire. But the boundaries did not stay fixed. Stutthof began to expand. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as new barracks rose from the mud. The small detention center transformed into a massive industrial complex of death. It was no longer just for the elite. It became a destination for thousands from across Europe. There was no turning back. September 2nd, 1939. This was the day the first prisoners arrived at Stutthof. At first glance, a small transit camp for local activists, but in reality, a factory for systematic execution. As the war dragged on, the perimeter expanded. The site grew from a few huts into a massive network of death. Why did the camp grow so fast? The answer was simple. The Nazi state needed more space for those it wanted to disappear. The small prison transformed into a major killing center. Engineers installed miles of electrified barbed wire. They built dozens of wooden barracks and heavy watchtowers. The camp eventually controlled 39 subcamps across the entire region. The prisoner population changed. It became more diverse and more targeted. Jews from every corner of Europe arrived in packed cattle cars. Soviet prisoners of war, Roma families, and political dissidents followed. They were all labeled as enemies of the state. The scale was massive. By the time World War II ended in 1945, more than 110,000 people had passed through these gates. Most never walked out. At least 65,000 prisoners died inside. They died from starvation, typhus, and forced labor. They died from systematic beatings and formal executions. There was no mistake. Stutthof had every tool required for mass murder. The footage shows the infrastructure of the site. In 1943, the SS built a functional gas chamber. It was capable of killing dozens of people in a single cycle. Next to it stood the crematorium. The chimneys ran constantly to dispose of the evidence. Inside the barracks, prisoners were crammed onto wooden bunks. There was no hygiene. There was almost no food. Disease acted as a silent executioner. Typhus and dysentery swept through the rows of starving men and women. The guards added to the misery. The sound of heavy boots and barking dogs filled the air. Guards beat prisoners for no reason. They forced them to work until their hearts failed. In the winter, they marched them into the snow and left them to freeze. The camp was cruel by design. There was no chance of survival. Thus ended the lives of 65,000 people. Maximum suffering. That was the official policy of the camp administration. Every minute of a prisoner's life was engineered for pain. But the most disturbing element of Stutthof lay in its personnel. Women took an active role in the daily terror. These were not office workers, clerks, or medical nurses. They were trained combatants. The SS instructed them to be as brutal and violent as their male counterparts. They wore uniforms. They carried heavy weapons. They barked commands across the parade grounds. When a prisoner stumbled, these women delivered the punishment personally. What happened inside the fences of Stutthof set a dark precedent. The camp became a laboratory for cruelty. But when the gates finally opened, the world saw the evidence. The footage showed emaciated bodies and ash. The public reacted with immediate shock and outrage. The realization that women committed these crimes changed the narrative of the war. People demanded immediate justice. But justice did not arrive with the first soldiers. The war had to end completely. The borders had to be secured. Only then did the real work start. The hunt for the Stutthof guards began. There was no turning back. The reason was the rapid expansion of the Nazi system. It grew too large for men alone to control. As more Jews, Poles, and other targeted groups arrived at the camps, the SS faced a personnel crisis. They turned to ordinary women from across Germany and the occupied territories. These were not soldiers. Most had never held a weapon or seen a battlefield. 20 years old. That was the average age for many recruits. Some were secretaries or nurses. Others were rural laborers looking for steady pay and a meal during the chaos of the war. But once they signed the contract, the transformation began. The training took place at Ravensbrück or directly inside the concentration camps. It was short and intense. The curriculum was simple: how to break a human being. They were taught to use attack dogs. They were taught to maintain order through physical violence. How did a secretary become a killer? Training replaced empathy with routine. Their new title was Aufseherin, or female overseer. On paper, it sounded like a simple administrative role. In reality, it granted them absolute power over life and death. At Stutthof, 30 of these women joined the camp system. Their main duty was controlling the women's section. By the final years of the war, this section grew rapidly. The footage from the era shows the uniform: heavy boots, gray capes, and a leather belt. They carried whips, sticks, and pistols. The sound of leather hitting skin became constant. They yelled, insulted, kicked, and slapped prisoners every single day. Often, there was no reason for the assault. If a prisoner stumbled from hunger, the guards did not help. They punished. The violence escalated. Many of these women grew more brutal with time. Some took visible satisfaction in selecting who would work and who would die. A single finger pointed at a sick prisoner meant an immediate trip to the gas chamber. They did not wait for orders from men. The camera records their expressions, cold and indifferent. In many cases, these women acted entirely on their own. They made independent choices to kill. They were not just assistants to the SS. They were the system itself. The power was absolute. 1922, Hamburg. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann was born into a world of fashion and high society. She worked as a photographic model. She walked the streets of the city as a local celebrity. Magazines praised her looks. But by 1944, the dresses were gone. She arrived at the Stutthof concentration camp and put on a different uniform. The transformation was absolute. Barkmann was assigned to the selections. This meant she stood on the ramps as the transports arrived. She looked at thousands of women and children. With a flick of her finger, she chose who would live and who would go to the gas chambers. She did not hesitate. The camera records her face during these moments. There is no sign of regret. How did a model become a killer? At first glance, she was just a girl from the city. But in reality, she was one of the camp's most feared supervisors. She walked the campgrounds with a leather whip in her hand. She did not just carry it for show. She used it on the weakest inmates. Survivors remembered the sound of the leather hitting skin. They remembered the cold precision of her movements. She moved through the mud and the filth with the same posture she used on the runway. Events accelerated. Barkmann had no formal military training. She was a civilian recruit, yet she embraced the power of the SS immediately. She oversaw executions with total calm. Reports state that even the veteran male guards were shocked. They watched her stand by the gallows without blinking. She was confident. She was efficient. There was no mistake. Her actions were not the result of following orders blindly. She saw the death every day. She smelled the smoke from the crematoriums. She chose to be there. The footage from her later trial shows the result. She sat in the dock and fixed her hair. She adjusted her clothes. She treated the courtroom like a stage. Thus ended the career of the beautiful Spectre. 1920. This was the birth year of Eva Paradis. Before the war, she worked as a school teacher. Her daily routine involved classrooms, textbooks, and the safety of children. She was supposed to be a protector of the young. Why did a teacher become a killer? The answer lies in the SS Women's Auxiliary Corps. In 1944, Paradis arrived at the Stutthof concentration camp. She stripped away her former identity. The transition was immediate. Witnesses recorded her actions in detail. She did not just follow orders, she sought out victims. The footage from the era shows the harsh conditions of the camp, but it cannot capture the sound of her voice. Survivors remembered her screams. She was unpredictable. Paradis would grab emaciated women by the hair and throw them onto the frozen ground. She used wooden sticks to strike those too weak to stand. This was not a rare occurrence. It was a daily ritual. She took pleasure in the humiliation of the sick. Empathy was gone. Aggression took its place. Then there was Elizabeth Becker. Her pre-war life was even more ordinary. She worked at a cinema. Her world was made of film reels and fiction. She had no training in law or policing. She had no history of violence. But the camp changed her. She arrived at Stutthof as a young woman with no experience. The environment acted as a catalyst. She adapted to the system of terror with terrifying speed. She became a dedicated student of brutality. She learned how to manage prisoners through fear. She mastered the logistics of the camp. At first glance, they were ordinary citizens, but in reality, they were the machinery of death. Becker showed no hesitation. She performed her duties with a cold efficiency that shocked even her peers. She didn't just participate, she excelled in the field of camp discipline. Year after year, she refined her methods. She became an expert in the application of force. There was no turning back for either woman. They chose this path. They stayed until the end. The trial records show the final result. September 1944. Gerda Steinhoff entered the gates of the Stutthof concentration camp. She was 22 years old. Before this, she worked as a domestic servant and a farmhand. She had no history of violence. She had no training in torture. But the transition took only a few days. Why did an ordinary woman become a killer? The answer is simple. The system rewarded it. Within weeks, Steinhoff was no longer a civilian. She wore the SS uniform. She carried a whistle and a heavy set of keys. She escorted prisoners to the selection ramps. Her arrival coincided with the mass extermination of Jews deported from the Baltic states. The footage from the era shows the scale. Thousands of people arrived in cattle cars. Steinhoff stood on the platform. Survivors remembered her face. They described a terrifying detail. She did not scream. She did not lose her temper. She stood in silence as the lines were divided. One side meant labor. The other side meant the gas chamber. But this was only the beginning. Steinhoff rose through the ranks with lethal speed. She became a Blockführerin, a camp overseer. Now, she held absolute power over hundreds of women. Witnesses later testified about her behavior. She didn't just follow orders, she enjoyed the status. She began carrying a leather riding crop. The visual is sharp. Steinhoff walked through the barracks. If a prisoner moved too slowly, the crop fell. If a prisoner spoke, the crop fell. She used the wood and leather to assert her presence. There was no mistake about her intent. She was now a functional part of the machinery of death. How did she react during the killings? Survivors recalled a chilling habit. While picking out victims for the gas chambers, Steinhoff often smiled. It wasn't a mask. It was a genuine expression of satisfaction. She watched the selections with total calmness. Her pulse did not quicken. Her hands did not shake. Events accelerated. In just 5 months, she transformed from a quiet servant into one of the most feared women in the Nazi camp system. She proved that the transition to genocide does not require a monster. It only requires an ordinary person willing to pick up a whip. The court delivered its verdict later. But at Stutthof, Steinhoff was the law. August 1944. The war reached its final stage, but the pace of killings only increased. Steinhoff did not slow down. She became more active. She did not just obey commands, she pursued a career. Her rise through the SS ranks reflected raw ambition. Wanda Klav had no military background. Before the war, she worked in a jam factory. Later, she married and lived as a housewife. This changed when she joined the SS Auxiliary Services. Her life took a dark turn. Klav did not show hesitation when she entered Stutthof. She was aggressive from the first day. The prisoners heard her before they saw her. She had a sharp voice and a fast temper. The footage from the era shows the camp gates. Inside, Klav lashed out at prisoners without provocation. During the later trials, witnesses remembered her clearly. She was one of the loudest female guards in the camp. She was also one of the most violent. Klav used wooden sticks to strike the prisoners. If she did not have a stick, she used whatever was at hand. At first glance, a housewife, but in reality, a predator. Her own words during the trial revealed the truth. She showed no remorse. She told the court she was tougher than most men. She did not just enforce orders, she personalized the violence. Her time at the camp was brief, but the survivors remembered her wrath for decades. How were these women chosen? It was not because of their skills. The SS selected them because they could follow orders without mercy. They were not victims of circumstance. They were not forced to commit atrocities. The sound of iron gates locking. They volunteered. They followed orders and often went beyond them. They took power when the regime offered it. But this was only the beginning. Justice would catch up soon. The trials began in 1945. The era of the female guards ended on the gallows. May 8, 1945. Nazi Germany officially surrendered. Allied troops moved deep into the German heartland and uncovered the concentration camps. They found barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and iron gates. What did the soldiers find inside? At first, they saw smoke. Then, they saw the truth. It was a factory designed for death. The footage from 1945 shows the reality. Thousands of unburied corpses lay in open pits. Survivors weighed less than 80 pounds. The air in the barracks smelled of lime, filth, and decay. Photographs captured bodies stacked like cordwood against brick walls. This was not traditional warfare. This was industrialized murder on a continental scale. Public outrage erupted across the globe. Citizens in London, Paris, and Warsaw demanded justice. The Allied powers and the new Polish government began a massive manhunt. They did not only want the architects like Hitler or Himmler. They wanted the men who pulled the triggers. They targeted the guards, the doctors, and the administrators. How did the killers react? They ran. Former SS officers stripped off their black uniforms and burned them in forest clearings. Some shaved their heads to hide their identity. Others stole civilian clothes and blended into the millions of refugees clogging the roads. They took fake names and forged identity papers. But hiding was difficult. Survivors remembered specific faces. They recognized the unique cadence of a guard's voice or the way a commandant held his whip. By 1946, the search shifted into high gear. Intelligence officers raided mountain cabins and basement apartments. Retribution was swift and often violent. Many guards did not live to see a courtroom. Former prisoners turned the tables on their captors. Resistance groups tracked down hidden SS units in the woods. Local mobs seized camp workers before the police could intervene. In the chaos of occupied Germany, the hunters became the hunted. There was no escape for the guilty. The search continued for decades. The era of the trials had begun.